In this video, I will be performing the Passacaille in C major by Louis Couperin. Like the majority of Louis Couperin's harpsichord works, this Passacaille is included in the Bohème manuscript. However, the way it is presented in the manuscript raises some issues in terms of the order of certain sections. So in this introduction, I would like to talk about how the piece is structured, address what is unclear about its presentation in the Bohème manuscript, and finally, discuss how I chose to navigate through the piece. Let's start with the structure of the piece, and the first thing to mention pertains to its title. A Passacaille, or Passacaille, is a piece usually in triple meter that is built upon an ostinato bass, that is, a musical motif or phrase in the bass line that is continuously repeated throughout the piece. This Passacaille is indeed in triple meter, and the motif that will be repeated again and again is a descending tetrachord, in other words, this one. While, as expected, this descending tetrachord motif is indeed in the bass, Louis Couperin has complicated things a tiny bit by stating it in what seems like two semi-independent lines, one of which also contains some ornamental notes, and with the two lines presenting the four notes of the descending tetrachord out of sync. In other words, each of the two lines presents the notes of the tetrachord at different times. Let me play the first phrase in its complete form, and while I would suggest paying more attention to what the left hand is doing, afterwards I will isolate the left hand and play it on its own. So here's now the first phrase with the complete tetrachord in the left hand. Now what is happening in the left hand is this, and I will play the two lines with two hands just so you can kind of see them a little separate. And notice that we are going to have the notes of the tetrachord, but they're happening at two different octaves and at different times. So the top of the two bass lines is doing it here, while the lower of the two bass lines is stating it in the lowest octave. So both of these lines together sound like this. The tetrachord motif occupies four measures, and despite the out of syncness of the two left-hand lines, each of the notes of the tetrachord always appears at the beginning of each measure in one of the two lines. The first three notes of the tetrachord occupy one full measure, while the last note occupies two beats of the fourth measure, with the last beat returning to the tonic of C. This pattern will continue throughout the piece. The first phrase functions as a refrain because this Passacaille is structured like a rondo, meaning that we have a refrain alternating with contrasting sections. But since this piece is also a Passacaille, all the contrasting sections have the same motif in their bass line as the refrain. In other words, the descending tetrachord. Of course, each contrasting section is going to have a different melodic profile, and the descending tetrachord motif is going to be embellished in different ways. But it is this descending tetrachord that remains constantly present and thus functions as a unifying thread. Before we go on and look at the challenges of how to navigate through the piece, it's important to mention that, perhaps somewhat confusingly, in the French terminology of the time, both the refrain as well as the contrasting sections are referred to as couplets. In this Passacaille, the refrain is labeled as Grand Couplet, and then the first contrasting section is labeled as the second couplet, etc., etc. Let's look for a moment at the beginning of the piece as it appears in the Dulcken manuscript. The first thing I want you to notice is that the opening four-measure phrase is labeled as the Grand Couplet. It is written out twice, and this pattern of 4+4 measures is going to inform all of the following couplets. Notice also that at the end of the second statement of the Grand Couplet, the scribe has written the word fin, which to me indicates that the Grand Couplet should also serve as the conclusion of the piece, which is what we expect in a rondo form. The refrain always concludes the piece. Let's switch now to the last two lines of the piece as they appear in the Dulcken manuscript, because it is here that some of the major challenges are located. The penultimate line contains the last measure of the 9th couplet and the complete statement of the 10th couplet. Notice there are no repeat signs between the end of the 9th couplet and the beginning of the 10th couplet. The last line is where things get fairly complicated. First, we get a measure labeled Grand Couplet par bémol, followed by the abbreviation etc. What we have here is the beginning of the Grand Couplet in the minor mode. The scribe has only supplied the first measure and expects the performer to play the remainder of the Grand Couplet in the minor mode. Then we get the 6th couplet, clearly appearing out of order. Incidentally, this is not the only couplet that appears out of order. Finally, we have the first measure of the Grand Couplet, this time in its original form in the major mode, again with the etc. abbreviation. Let's see now if we can make some sense out of the last line, but before I go on and explain my approach, it is important to emphasize that there is more than one way of solving this puzzle, and indeed, if you listen to other recordings, you will notice that different performers navigate the piece in different ways. I hope I can provide some clarification of some aspects of what is going on and the reasoning behind my choices, but I would say that anyone interested in performing the piece should definitely examine the original manuscript on their own. And thankfully, the Dulcken manuscript is available on IMSLP. Let's start with the easier part, which is the misplaced 6th couplet. I think the scribe has made it pretty clear that this is to be performed after the 5th couplet. As for the first measure of the Grand Couplet that follows, this is simply an indication that the Grand Couplet as a whole should be played after the 6th couplet and before going on to the 7th couplet. I think this is fairly logical. This leaves us with the one measure of the Grand Couplet in the minor mode, which presents two issues. How minor is it really supposed to be? And where in the piece is it supposed to be played? Playing the Grand Couplet in full minor mode is of course possible, but first of all, the scribe did not provide flats for the A's in the first measure, whereas he did put a flat before the E. And secondly, the low A flat required in the left hand would very likely not be available on a keyboard with a short octave. Let me briefly demonstrate these 2 points. What I meant with the first one, that he did not provide A flats, is that if we look at that one measure of the Grand Couplet in the minor mode, in the right hand we have this. So with A naturals, he didn't write this. So we don't have A flats, he wrote this. And then my second point is this very low A flat, which again, if you have a keyboard with a short octave, very likely this would not have been available. What I choose to do is this, and incidentally, this is also the solution adopted by several modern editions. You could argue that this somewhat waters down the effect of switching to the minor mode, but to me it has two advantages. The first being that we maintain the exact same tetrachord. In other words, we keep instead of this. And the second, that this is a much more ambiguous in-between harmonic world. So in its own way, it creates a more potent harmonic suspense. The second issue involves figuring out exactly where in the piece this minor mode Grand Couplet should occur. If we refer back to the last line of the piece in the Boin manuscript, since the sixth couplet and the following measure of the original Grand Couplet are supposed to be played earlier in the piece, then technically that leaves the Grand Couplet in the minor mode as the last event in the piece. And indeed, most of the performances I know end with the minor mode Grand Couplet. The reason I'm not convinced the piece should end this way is that, as I've already mentioned, the scribe wrote the word fin at the end of the second statement of the original Grand Couplet. To me, this signifies that the piece should conclude with the original Grand Couplet, and this is what I have chosen to do. So here's how my performance unfolds. First, I play the two statements of the Grand Couplet. Then I play the contrasting couplets, and between each one I play the Grand Couplet. In other words, I follow the normal rondo form. Where I do things a little differently is with couplets 8 and 9, because again, the Boin manuscript is not entirely clear on this, and I think that the 9th couplet is a variant of the 8th couplet. Therefore, I play the 8th and 9th couplets as a unit. After the 10th couplet, I play the Grand Couplet in the minor mode, and finally, I conclude the piece with the original Grand Couplet. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the performance.